All right, let's jump right into this explainer. If you're a CSS aspirant, or honestly, just someone who really wants to understand the foundational mechanics of Pakistan's governance, you're in the right place. Today, we're breaking down Maleeha Lodhi's deeply influential 2011 structural analysis from her book, Pakistan Beyond the Crisis State. For anyone tackling Pakistan affairs, international relations, or current affairs, this text is basically required reading. We're going to impartially unpack exactly how she diagnoses the country's structural challenges, and then we'll dive into her prescription for moving forward. Now, right off the bat, Lodhi's central thesis completely challenges a lot of the popular discourse you might hear. For decades, it's been incredibly common to just blame a lack of wealth or, frankly, external conspiracies for the nation's instability. But Lodhi completely shifts that lens. She argues that the country isn't actually doomed by some inherent lack of resources, and it isn't just a passive victim of outside forces. Instead, she points the finger squarely at internal political mismanagement and systemic governance failures. And honestly, that's a massive shift in perspective, right? Because if the core problems are internal and administrative, it means the solutions are completely within reach too. But first things first, we need to get our definitions straight to really anchor this analysis. You'll often hear Western media casually toss around the term failed state. Lodhi pushes back on this hard. She defines Pakistan as a crisis state. So what does that mean? Well, it's a state stuck in a perpetual, seemingly endless loop of instability because of poor governance. But, and this is a huge but, it is absolutely not failed. It survives. In fact, it often thrives in certain pockets, largely because it has a deeply resilient society and some very powerful, enduring institutions. Establishing this specific academic baseline is crucial because it completely changes how you approach the cure. So, here is our game plan for today's explainer. First, the diagnosis. We'll look at the core deficits and elite capture. Second, the prescription, the necessary policy shifts. And finally, a conceptual analysis of state classifications. Okay, part 1, the diagnosis. Identifying the structural symptoms. Let's impartially lay out the systemic variables that keep the nation locked in this cycle of crisis. Lodhi essentially acts like a doctor diagnosing a patient, and she identifies 3 primary deficits at the root of the problem. First up is the security deficit. This covers the whole spectrum, from internal militancy to the incredibly complex border dynamics with India and Afghanistan. Next is the governance deficit. This is simply the state's lack of capacity to deliver everyday basic public services. Think health, education, infrastructure. And finally, because the state struggles so much to provide that security and governance, it inevitably suffers from a legitimacy deficit. It's like a domino effect. When the basic social contract breaks down, citizens just lose faith in the state's authority altogether. And when we dig just a bit deeper into that governance deficit, we hit the undeniable reality of elite capture. Just picture this. A microscopic 2% slice of the population controls the vast majority of the political landscape, the agricultural land, and the broader economy. And the real kicker, they largely evade equitable taxation. When the absolute wealthiest segment of a society doesn't pay its fair share, the state literally cannot fund its own development. This dynamic of elite capture is what ultimately drives widespread poverty, deepens inequality, and creates this agonizing, endless dependency on IMF loans just to keep the lights on. Then we have to look at the civil-military imbalance, which is another major diagnostic variable here. If we look at this objectively as an academic concept, a very clear historical trend emerges. On one hand, you have civilian institutions that have frequently been hampered by dynastic politics, pretty fragile party structures, and just a general lack of administrative capacity. On the other hand, the military has remained highly dominant, boasting really strong institutional capacity and exerting a massive influence over national policymaking. In Lodhi's view, this historical dominance in shaping policy has, over time, inadvertently distorted the democratic process and further stunted the growth of robust civilian-led institutions. The final piece of this diagnostic puzzle is foreign policy. Historically, there's been a heavy reliance on U.S. aid, especially during the War on Terror years. And what that did was create a highly transactional relationship. So instead of the state sitting down and formulating proactive, long-term strategic plans based entirely on its own national interests, its policies became incredibly reactive to external demands. That kind of dependency really compromises true sovereignty, and it keeps the nation stuck in this permanent reactionary crisis management mode. All right, so we know the symptoms. Let's move to part 2, the prescription, formulating the way forward. What are Lodhi's actionable reforms to actually cure this? Well, the absolute bedrock for recovery actually starts with a single number, 18. The 18th Constitutional Amendment is highlighted as the single most critical structural reform needed to establish true federalism. By taking power away from the center and handing genuine autonomy to the provinces, the state can finally start addressing local, regional grievances and actually improve governance capacity on the ground. It is quite literally the constitutional foundation for moving beyond the crisis state. Building on that, getting the house in order really requires a sequential, internally driven approach. Lodhi maps out 6 vital steps. Number 1, you have to strengthen democracy. That means ensuring civilian supremacy and building political parties that aren't just dynastic families. 2, economic reform. Remember that elite capture we talked about? You have to broaden the tax base and end those elite subsidies. 3, depoliticize state institutions and strictly enforce the rule of law. 4, execute a massive pivot in national security, moving away from pure geostrategic posturing and focusing heavily on geoeconomics. 5, rebuild that broken social contract by actually delivering tangible services to the citizens. And 6, prioritize regional trade with neighbors like India and Afghanistan rather than leaning into conflict. The big takeaway here, the future of the country lies in doing the hard work internally, not in constantly looking for an external savior.
Let's transition to part 3, conceptual analysis, state classifications. This is to make sure you have the exact academic frameworks you need for your exams.
Because, precision in academic language absolutely matters. Let's look at the spectrum of how states are classified. At the very top, you have a hard state. Think high capacity, rigid rule enforcement, and total unquestioned authority. Now, at the complete opposite end of the spectrum is a phased state. That's a total, utter collapse of authority where the government simply cannot provide even the most basic services or security. Now, here's the key. Pakistan doesn't fit either of those extremes. It falls right into the middle category, the crisis state. It's characterized by weak governance and perpetual instability, which means it definitely isn't a hard state. But because of its enduring institutions and its incredibly resilient society, it avoids the total collapse of a failed state. Nailing this distinction is absolutely crucial for any accurate political analysis. Now, to be totally objective here, a focused learner must always look at the limitations of any text. Context is everything, right? This book was published back in 2011. That is pre-CPEC, pre-PTI government, and before the massive security shifts post-APS. So some of the landscape has definitely changed. Secondly, it's written very much from the perspective of elite diplomats and academics, so it can sometimes miss the everyday grassroots reality of the general public. And finally, some critics argue the analysis is a bit too liberal, perhaps downplaying the heavy role that ideology actually plays in the nation's political fabric. Acknowledging these blind spots doesn't ruin the book. It actually shows you have a much deeper, more critical understanding of the material. Before we wrap up today, I really want to take a quick second to give a massive shout out to instructor Tausif Iqbal Khan. He provided the incredibly comprehensive framework that made this entire analysis possible. His advice to structure your essays by using one paragraph to diagnose the problem, immediately followed by a paragraph outlining Lodhi's prescribed solution, is absolute gold for CSS candidates. Seriously, take note of that. And hey, to keep mastering your CSS prep, make sure you subscribe to Dawn Times for more exceptional study materials just like this explainer. All right, as we close out this explainer, I want to leave you with one final, pretty provocative thought to chew on for your essays and debates. Considering everything we've unpacked today, the deep deficits, the elite capture, the desperate need for a new social contract, which of these has to come first to actually break this cycle? Do you force tough economic reforms through in order to eventually stabilize the politics? Or is achieving political stability the absolute non-negotiable prerequisite before any real economic reform can even get off the ground? Think critically about that, apply Lodhi's framework to your answer, and I will catch you in the next explainer.